I thought it'd be appropriate to maybe start out with a little Irish, huh? Joich, Folcha, Gurav Maragut Atiat, Daniel Goodman, is Anamdom. Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Daniel Goodman, Museum Director of Rancho de las Golondrinas. Welcome to the 22 Winter Lecture Series, Speaking of Traditions. El Rancho de las Golondrinas has been putting on this lecture series since 1999, making this the 24th year. And we're happy to be partners with the New Mexico Museum of Art in what I think is the premier venue in Santa Fe, the St. Francis Auditorium. At this time, please remember to silence your cell phones. Everyone can support both Golondrinas and the New Mexico Museum of Art by becoming members. It makes a difference and goes a long way in supporting both of our organizations. Just check our respective websites for details or join on your way out this evening. In case you didn't know, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And we are hosting 50 events for 50 years. This is event number 4. For those of you watching this broadcast later, on the Golondrinas live sessions, be sure to post any questions in the comments section, and they will be answered. Tonight, we're honored to have Henry Rivera speaking on the San Patricio Battalion, Mexico's Irish soldiers. A little-known fact of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 is that deserters from the U.S. Army, most of whom were Irish, fought for Mexico and were known as the San Patricio Battalion. They fought under a green flag emblazoned with a figure of St. Patrick and are heroes in Mexico even today. Learn what motivated these men, what fate awaited them when captured, and how the racial and religious climate of the 1840s and its correlation with manifest destiny impacted them. Henry Rivera is the board chair at El Rancho de las Golondrinas and is an internationally recognized communications lawyer, author, speaker, and conference leader. A former commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, he has been named one of the District of Columbia's super lawyers, among the best lawyers in America in communications law, and among the top 12 telecom experts in the U.S. He is a partner in the Washington, D.C. firm Wiley Wren, and a native New Mexican who obtained both his BA and JD from the University of New Mexico. He also holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Albuquerque. He has a passion for history, particularly the U.S. Civil War, and is a member of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. His topic today is a fascinating and obscure one that he's been bringing more attention to these last few years. Please welcome Henry Rivera.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. It's always embarrassing to speak to an empty hall, so I'm glad you're here. And I heard a joke the other day, which I will share with you. The joke goes, always remember, in the Canary Islands, there are no canaries. And in the Virgin Islands, there are no canaries either. So as you know, I'm going to talk about the San Patricio Battalion. But before I do that, I want to give you a little information on the 1846-1848 Mexican-American War so that you have some context for the San Patricio story. I begin with Texas because Texas was certainly the catalyst for this war. Prior to 1836, Texas was a department or state of the Republic of Mexico and part of another Mexican state or department called Coahuila. In 1835, Texans revolted against Mexico, justifying their actions on, among other things, Mexico's attempt to restrict immigration and limit slaveholding. Texas declared its independence, formed the Lone Star Republic of Texas, and sought both annexation by the United States and statehood. While the United States recognized Texas independence in 1837, many Americans objected to annexation and statehood on the grounds that Texas would become a slave state. Nevertheless, President John Tyler proposed a treaty that would both annex Texas and grant it statehood. Between 1835 and 1837, Britain attempted to negotiate a treaty of mutual assistance with the Lone Star Republic of Texas, in which Britain would recognize it, provide it both financial assistance and military protection if Texas did not join the United States, abolished slavery, and provided free trade with Britain. Britain's involvement with Texas during this period is complicated, but essentially its goal was a strong, independent Texas that would act as a buffer, not only against American westward expansion, but also against American trade with Mexico and other Central and South American countries. Americans born prior to the Revolutionary War had a deep-seated distrust toward and fear of Britain. The War of 1812, the British invasion of the United States, and the burning of Washington naturally increased hostility between Britain and the U.S. Rivalry between the two nations increased as they fought for leadership in the affairs of the Southern Hemisphere. In addition, the conflict between the two countries over the Oregon boundary question was in full bloom. Therefore, Britain's attempt to involve itself with Texas excited popular and congressional interest in Texas in the Texas annexation issue. The United States was concerned that Britain's interference in Texas was violating the Monroe Doctrine, which Britain denied. But when it became apparent that President John Tyler's administration was interested in annexing Texas only to prevent Britain from interfering with slavery, as opposed to stopping Britain from interfering with the Monroe Doctrine, Northern congressmen could not and did not vote for Tyler's proposed annexation treaty, and it did not pass the Senate. In the 1844 election, James K. Polk defeated Henry Clay. Texas annexation, which Polk wanted and Clay did not, was a very significant issue during the campaign. Clay was wary of starting a war with Mexico, and he therefore opposed annexation. But being against annexation was at variance with the preponderance of voter sentiment on the most powerful issue of the day, and that was American expansion and manifest destiny. And he lost the election by a slim margin of 39,450 votes. In 1846, popular support for annexation and war with Mexico was widespread and enthusiastic. This support would wane significantly by the summer of 1847 as America grew war-weary and casualties mounted. A series of what many believe were insincere diplomatic moves by Polk to avoid war with Mexico over Texas annexation followed his election. Polk did not think that Mexico would go to war with the United States, and therefore he attempted to bully Mexico into negotiating the sale of California and New Mexico, which included today's Arizona. When Polk's bullying failed, he turned up the heat with the following acts of aggression against Mexico. First, in December of 1845, despite a warning from Mexico that it would consider Texas annexation an act of war, Polk engineered a joint resolution of Congress whereby the United States annexed Texas and promised to defend it against any military action by Mexico. Second, after annexation, the United States adopted the 1835 Texas claim that the Rio Grande was the border of the new state of Texas, and not the Rio Nueces, located 200 miles east of the Rio Grande, which Mexico had always claimed as the border. Third, in June of 1845, Polk instructed his Secretary of War, William Marcy, of Fort Marcy fame, to order General Zachary Taylor to take 4,000 troops and move to the Rio Grande, thus occupying the disputed territory between the Rio Nueces and the Rio Grande. This disputed territory was known as the Nueces Strip. Taylor moved to the Rio Grande and he built Fort Brown, which was originally called Fort Texas, to command the city of Matamoros, Mexico. The site of this fort is today's Brownsville, Texas. This was the final straw for Mexico, and with Taylor's troop movement, Mexico considered her territory invaded and hostilities commenced. Just a footnote here, Zachary Taylor would ride his fame earned in this war to become the Whig nominee for president and win the 1848 election. On April 25, 1846, General Taylor suspected a Mexican patrol had crossed the Rio Grande upstream of Fort Brown, and he sent his own patrol to investigate. The small U.S. patrol did indeed locate a large force of Mexican cavalry at a place called Rancho de Carrocitos, and the two forces clashed, resulting in an American defeat with several dead, wounded, and American prisoners. This gave Polk the casus belli he needed. He sent a message to Congress declaring that since Mexico had shed American blood on American soil, a state of war now existed between the U.S. and Mexico. Since this incident took place in the Nueces Strip, many, including Abraham Lincoln, who was then a Whig congressman, questioned Polk's rationale in claiming that American blood had been shed on American soil. Lincoln joined other Whigs in denouncing Polk for the unilateral decision to declare war against Mexico. Lincoln attempted to show that Polk purposely distorted the facts to persuade Congress to ratify his decision and labeled it an unjust and unprovoked war. Ulysses Grant, himself a Mexican War veteran, called it the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. Henry David Thoreau went to jail rather than pay taxes to support the war, and John Quincy Adams and Daniel Webster, both Whigs, labeled the war as unconstitutional. Are these views correct? Is Mexico blameless and the victim here? Robert W. Mary, a historian and author of A Country of Vast Designs, James K. Polk, The Mexican War and the Conquest of the American Continent, thinks not. Mary believes that these views ignore Mexico's role in bringing on the war. He cites Mexico's refusal to recognize the Rio Grande as the Texas border, notwithstanding that Mexico did nothing militarily or diplomatically to dispute Texas' border claim for 9 years. Mexico also withdrew its ambassador, cut off relations with the U.S., declared annexation an act of war, fired the first shots, inflicted the first casualties, and dared the U.S. to accept this bloodletting as the natural and acceptable outcome of the dispute. In sum, Mary believes Mexico cannot avoid its share of the blame for this war. The war with Mexico is one of the few wars not commemorated in Washington, D.C. There's no memorial or statue. It is America's forgotten war. Among all the wars fought by the United States, it is the least discussed, least written about, least understood, least known, and is the first war that a large number of Americans harbor some guilt about. This is ironic because it added more to the U.S. Treasury and landmass of the United States, over 50% of Mexico was annexed, than all other wars combined, but at a cost of 13,780 American lives, 16% of those who served, one of the highest casualty rates of any American war. Nearly 25,000 Mexican lives, and these were mostly civilians, and millions of U.S. dollars. Yet, it is relegated to a dark corner of American history and memory. No wonder then that the story I'm about to tell you about a small group of soldiers who fought for Mexico is virtually lost to history. My observations are not only about this small group of soldiers, but also at a 10,000-foot level about the social, religious, and economic status of both Ireland and the United States in the 1840s, which serves as the context and foundation for the group of men known as the San Patricio Battalion. While barely a footnote in U.S. history books, they were decorated for valor by the Mexican Army. They were also called Los Colorados Valientes, or the brave redheads, because of their ruddy, sunburnt complexions and red hair. It may surprise that an unusually large number of U.S. troops who fought in the Mexican War deserted. More than 9,000, or 8%. This is the highest percentage of desertions of any foreign war waged by the U.S. Many who deserted were immigrants. 40% of the regular army were recent immigrants. When integrated into the Mexican army, the San Patricios fought under a green silk banner. Since no flags or depictions of this flag are known to have survived, besides being green, we're not quite sure what it looked like. Many believe it had an image of St. Patrick emblazoned in silver on one side and a shamrock and harp on the other. Lieutenant John Riley, formerly a private in the U.S. Army, will be forever associated with the San Patricios. Riley gave this group its name, its distinctive flag, and he personally recruited many of them. He was an artillery expert, and many believe that prior to immigrating to the United States from Canada, he served as an officer or non-commissioned officer in the British Army. Riley would turn the San Patricios into a crack artillery arm of the Mexican Army. You'll hear more about Riley in a short video we'll screen at the end of my remarks. We're not sure how large the San Patricio Battalion was. Numbers range between 175 and 700. They were originally called the Legion of Foreigners. Some were Mexican citizens of European birth, others were resident foreigners in Mexico. Some, like Riley, were deserters, and many were Irish and Catholic. The San Patricios saw action in most of the major battles of the war. While it's true that the battalion was not composed exclusively of Irish Catholics, it did contain a significant number, and the group was clearly perceived as Irish and Catholic by both the Mexican and American armies. I mentioned that these men were perceived as Catholic because religion played a significant role in stimulating desertions. For example, at the Battle of Monterrey, there was a wholesale slaughter of civilians who were mostly Catholic by Texans and other volunteer troops. Texas troops harbored an implacable hatred toward Mexicans. The genesis of this hatred was likely Santana's brutality at the Alamo and Goliad, or time spent in Mexican prisons. Texans saw the war as an opportunity for vengeance and took full advantage of it. U.S. Army officers had great difficulty controlling non-regular Army troops who were volunteers in various state regiments. These volunteer troops committed many depredations against Mexican civilians. These atrocities at Monterrey, plus the burning of the Catholic cathedral there, and the threat to murder more civilians, caused many U.S. troops to abandon the Army. Anti-Catholic sentiment was rampant among state volunteers. The Mexican military capitalized on this by sending messages addressed to Catholic soldiers in the U.S. Army. One such message said, "Are Catholic Irishmen to be the destroyers of Catholic temples, the murderers of Catholic priests, and the founders of heretical rites in this pious nation? Come over to us. You will be received under the laws of that truly Christian hospitality and good faith which Irish guests are entitled to expect from a Catholic nation. May Mexicans and Irishmen, united by the sacred tie of religion and benevolence, form only one people." Indeed, by means of an extensive propaganda campaign waged by the Mexican military and aimed at Irish soldiers, in the U.S. Army, Mexico did its best to convince Irish soldiers that religion was the primary cause of the war. Were the soldiers of the San Patricio Battalion, as some American commentators have held, cowards or disgruntled enlisted men who deserted just to get benefits that Mexico promised deserters? Or had they perhaps been captured by the Mexican army while drunk on a pass and forced to fight for Mexico? Mexican commentators hold that these men were far from the usual deserter. Rather, they were heroes who fought for Mexico because they believed in the cause for which Mexico was fighting. As evidence, they cite their commendations for bravery, their unit cohesiveness under their green banner, and their camaraderie. Despite the conventional wisdom, not all San Patricios were deserters. In fact, American records show that only 72 were U.S. Army deserters. These records also show that they were enlisted men, and most were skilled artillerists who had served in the British or other armies. Prior to 1847, Mexican records show that the San Patricios' commanding officers were Mexicans. This might suggest a lack of trust in the San Patricios. But if so, Wouldn't the Mexican general have kept them in battle in front of his troops so that they could be watched and managed? The Mexican generals did not do this. For example, at the Battle of Buena Vista, the general placed them where he could make best use of their artillery skills, on the flank, where their guns could enfilade the Americans. This was a position of honor, manned by men with an esprit de corps, trusted by the Mexican general and his army to make best use of their artillery expertise. The San Patricios were heroic and skillful at Buena Vista, and after the battle, Riley was promoted to captain. He and a few other San Patricios were designated to receive the Cross of Honor. San Patricio's commanding officer said that the San Patricios fought with daring bravery and that they were worthy of the most consummate praise. The foregoing is not characteristic of deserters and misfits. Rather, I suggest it is characteristic of a group of men who believed in the cause for which they were fighting. What prompted so many to desert the U.S. Army? To answer this important question, we must examine three elements integral to the United States population of the 1840s. First, in the United States of the mid-19th century, the notion of being an American was in its infancy, and the primary presence of the national government in the everyday lives of Americans was the Postal Service. A general mistrust of federal authority bred loyalty to one state. Most Americans considered themselves Virginians or Texans, and only vaguely Americans. For example, prior to the war with Mexico, attempts at expansionism found expression in independent republics like the Lone Star Republic of Texas and the Bear Flag Republic in California, and not in a larger America. Another example, as I noted earlier, U.S. Army officers had great difficulty controlling non-regular Army volunteer troops. One reason for this is that these troops, who came from various states, while signing on to be part of the federal force that was fighting Mexico, operated independently and obeyed only their own leaders. Witness the massacre of 25 Mexican civilians in a cave at Agua Nueva. Soldiers and reporters who had witnessed the event and saw the scalped corpses wrote about it, some in great detail. The New Orleans Picayune stated, "It is impossible to excuse the conduct of our volunteers, and it is wrong to conceal the facts of this case." News of the American atrocities was reprinted in newspapers all over the country. In sum, there was a lack of national identity, which is critical to understanding that the mindset of 1840s Americans was not what we conceive of today as being the proper mindset of loyalty to an America involved in an armed conflict. This amorphous sense of national identity and lack of consensus about it hints at the basis for the many desertions that characterized the U.S. Army that went to war with Mexico. Second, many in the U.S. had a perception of Mexicans based on racial stereotyping that resulted from propaganda, not fact. The perception that Mexicans were inferior, uncivilized, and incapable of governing themselves served as a moral justification for taking their land and thereby expanding U.S. territory. You will recognize this attitude as a facet of manifest destiny so prevalent in 19th century America. If a whole race is inferior, 19th century Americans reasoned, Americans are duty-bound to bring the inferior race into civilization so that it can live in a secure and advanced culture, no matter the severity of the steps required to civilize it. Of course, the corollary to this perception of Mexicans as inferior was the belief held by most 19th century Americans that the Anglo-Saxon race was superior. Listen to what Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina had to say on this subject when the Senate debated the issue of whether the conquest and annexation of the entire country of Mexico should be the end result of the war. "I know, sir, that we have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. Ours, sir, is the government of the white man. And yet it is professed and talked about to erect these Mexicans into a territorial government and place them on an equality with the people of the United States. I protest utterly against such a project." The attitude that Mexicans were inferior sheds some light on why certain Irishmen were attracted to the Mexican cause. Third is the attitude of 1840s Americans toward the Irish and their fear of the Catholic Church. Prior to and during the 1830s and 40s, there was massive immigration of Irish to the United States. 50,000 Irish were entering every year. In the 60 years between 1780 and 1840, the Irish population in the U.S. had tripled, and between 1844 and 1849, 1 million Irish came to the U.S. This diaspora was caused by Ireland's economic problems, including the Great Famine of 1845. Just a footnote here, John Dalton, my great-grandfather, that's three greats, immigrated from Meade County, Ireland around this time, and he joined the U.S. Army in Pittsburgh. He made his way to New Mexico and settled in the upper Pecos River Valley. The Dalton Fishing Area and Dalton Canyon bear his name. This group of Irish was mostly tenant farmers with no marketable skills, who had been dispossessed of their land in Ireland, couldn't find work, and like my great-grandfather, some joined the army. Americans perceived them as being unwashed, quarrelsome, and priest-ridden papists who were neither thrifty nor industrious. They were not the type of person upon whom Americans wanted to bestow citizenship. The Protestant officers of these non-citizen enlisted men considered them mercenaries without any patriotic motivation. They were looked down on, mistreated, and assigned the worst jobs, including being substitutes for spent mules and horses to move cannon and munitions. Protestant church services were an integral part of Army life in the 1840s, and in some camps, attendance was mandatory. A soldier could be punished for failure to attend. While a third of the regular Army was Catholic, there were no Catholic chaplains, and Catholic soldiers were often forced to attend Protestant services, where Catholicism was many times criticized and condemned. Irish soldiers were overwhelmingly Catholic, and as victims of prejudice in the virulent anti-Catholic American society generally, and in the U.S. Army in particular, some were undoubtedly sympathetic to Mexico as another Catholic country being invaded by Protestant foreigners. The English Protestant invasion of Ireland was an ever-present memory for the vast majority of Irish immigrants who had recently been dispossessed of their land by absentee English landlords. Anti-Catholic riots were commonplace in northeastern American cities in the 1830s and 40s. In sum, the evidence is that these Irish deserters were not treated fairly by the U.S. Army, and that the hardships they faced was far greater than those of other soldiers. So denied the right to practice their religion, assigned the worst jobs, denied promotion despite their skills, proselytized by Protestant evangelists, and being part of a predominantly Protestant army invading a Catholic country, it's not surprising that some would find fighting under the banner of St. Patrick and defending the Mexican people in an unjust war an attractive alternative to remaining in the U.S. Army. Americans considered both the Mexicans and the Irish to be lazy, loud, undisciplined, ignorant, dangerous, and unfit for leadership in the army or of self-government. Therefore, the Irish Catholic soldier had more in common with Mexicans than with the army to which he currently belonged. This fact must have exacerbated the sympathy of the Irish for fellow Catholics being dispossessed of their land, just as the English had dispossessed the Irish of their land. While it's true that there were many reasons for the 9,257 desertions, the San Patricios deserting the U.S. Army and joining the Mexican Army is hard to explain but for the issue of religion. Witness the fact that the San Patricios did not desert to flee the conflict. Rather, they stayed to fight with the Mexicans for a cause they so obviously believed in. It is important to note that despite the foregoing, more than 5,000 Irish remained in the U.S. Army and fought with distinction. The end came for the San Patricios at the Battle of Churubusco, fought on August 20, 1847, where the San Patricios suffered great losses in killed, wounded, and captured. 85 became POWs, and 72 were charged with desertion, and they were court-martialed. In August of 1847, the courts-martial were held in two Mexican locations, San Angel and Tacubaya. In 1847, both were rural villages separate from Mexico City, but today both are part of Mexico City. The defendants relied on the defense that they were drunk when they deserted. Military law allowed for reduced culpability on the basis of drunkenness at the time of the offense, and hence a lesser punishment if convicted. Both the Manual for Courts-Martial and the Articles of War provided that the drunkenness was traditionally a significant factor in determining the intent of the accused, particularly in desertion cases. Unfortunately for the San Patricios, this defense was unavailing, as were all others. Their fate was sealed before they entered the courtroom. The trials were biased, with convictions preordained, and the sentences were death by hanging. As usual in courts-martial, the convictions were sent to the commanding general, Winfield Scott, for review. Scott determined that Riley and 7 others had deserted prior to the U.S. declaration of war, and therefore they could not receive the death penalty. Scott confirmed the hanging sentences of 50 of the San Patricios. Execution by hanging was in violation of the contemporary Articles of War, which provided that the penalty for desertion during time of war was death by firing squad. Hanging was reserved only for spies and for those committing atrocities against civilians, neither of which were among the charges brought against any of the San Patricios. Of course, those who could not receive the death penalty, 3 were to receive 50 lashes and branded on the right hip with the letter D, and to wear iron yokes with 3-foot-long prongs around their necks while confined to hard labor for the duration of the war. The remaining were to be whipped and branded with the letter D on their cheek and confined to hard labor. Those sentenced to the whip were to have their punishments administered by Mexican muleteers who were threatened with the same punishment if they were lenient in their strokes. Foreign civilians had never before carried out punishments ordered by a U.S. court-martial. Around 6 a.m., 16 Patricios were marched into a plaza and halted beneath a large scaffold. 14 were bound to trees and whipped with whips made of 9 18-inch knotted rawhide lashes. The officer in charge of the punishment forgot to count midway through the lashings, so that 59 lashes had been administered before the muleteers were ordered to stop. By that time, according to an American eyewitness, the backs of the victims had the appearance of a pounded piece of raw beef, the blood oozing from every stripe. After the floggings, heated branding irons were applied. Some were branded on their hip, and others, like Riley, were branded on their right cheek just below the eye. However, Riley had the misfortune of having his D branded backwards and was therefore branded again in the proper way on the left cheek. The Mexican witnesses, wafting the scent of blood and burning flesh, were shocked at the barbarity of the punishments. The next phase of the proceedings was the hangings. The scaffold was 14 feet high and 40 feet in length. 16 nooses were suspended from the crossbeam. There was no platform or trap. Instead, 8 wagons were drawn up underneath the nooses, alternating in their direction of travel. 2 prisoners were placed on each one. Priests were summoned to give absolution, and the wagons were driven away, leaving the 16 victims dangling from the nooses. Since there was no trap, there was no great drop, and the victims would not have died quickly as the result of a broken neck, which was the usual way a hanging victim was dispatched. One Mexican witness observed that they swung until they choked from their own weight. The remaining San Patricios were hung the following day from a tree 2 miles from San Angel. The Mexican government described the hangings as a cruel death or horrible torments, improper in a civilized age, and ironic for a people who aspire to the title of illustrious and humane. General Scott chose Colonel William Harney, a reckless, insubordinate, arrogant officer who had been indicted for murder, was an alleged rapist and a fugitive from justice with a known penchant for brutality, to punish the group of 38 San Patricios tried at Tacubaya. Harney erected a scaffold with 30 nooses with no platform or drop. They would be hung like those at San Angel by wagon, but without the benefit of clergy. Despite pleas for clemency by priests, politicians, and respectable ladies of Mexico City, 29 San Patricios were marched to the scaffold. Harney, noticing that there were 30 to be hung, asked where the missing man was. A U.S. Army physician informed Harney that the missing man was Francis O'Connor, who was in the hospital tent because he had lost both legs at Churubusco and was about to die from his wounds. Harney went into a rage and replied, "Bring the damn son of a bitch out. My orders are to hang 30, and by God, I'll do it." O'Connor was dragged from his sickbed, his stumps bleeding, and was propped up on a wagon and a noose placed around his neck. The hill on which the scaffold was erected provided a view of Chapultepec Castle, which would be the site of the major battle for control of Mexico City. Harney pointed to the Chapultepec and told the prisoners standing in the wagons with nooses around their necks that they would not be hanged until the American flag flew over Chapultepec. The battle raged while the now miserable San Patricios, bound hand and foot with nooses around their necks, stood or slumped in their wagons. They had been there since sunrise. Finally, around 9:30, the Stars and Stripes flew over Chapultepec, and Harney gave the order to move the wagons to hang the San Patricios. Harney's work was not done. The remaining 8 victims were tied up beneath their still kicking comrades, lashed, branded, and led off to prison. Harney would not remove the hanging bodies. He said, "I was ordered to have them hanged and have no orders to unhang them." Scott promoted Harney to the rank of brigadier general, and he was one of 4 general officers in the U.S. Army at the beginning of the Civil War. The execution of the San Patricios was the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Based on the rules of court-martial, the Articles of War of 1821, the Constitution, and standards of the 1840s, the punishments inflicted on the San Patricios, as well as the manner in which those punishments were carried out, were cruel, unusual, excessive, and I suggest motivated by racism and religious persecution. The punishments were also discriminatory. Of the more than 9,000 men who deserted during the Mexican War, the government opted not to prosecute or even apprehend the vast majority. Less than 100, or approximately 1%, were prosecuted, and only the San Patricios were punished by hanging. Moreover, in 1889, federal laws were passed essentially affording amnesty to Mexican war soldiers who had deserted, and granting them pardons, honorable discharges, and expungement of the charge of desertion from their records. As one historian has asked, why were the San Patricios hanged, and hanged in such a gruesome and sadistic way that it transcended even the barbarity of the times? Why were they whipped at the stake and branded? Selective prosecution, torture, and gratuitous brutality are generally the hallmarks of persecution, not justice. After the war, the Mexican Army began rebuilding the San Patricio Battalion. New deserters and some U.S. soldiers who requested their discharges in Mexico at war's end joined the new San Patricios. Riley and the other San Patricios released from prison also joined the reformed battalion. Ironically, when the war ended and the U.S. Army withdrew from its headquarters in Mexico City, the honor guard that replaced the U.S. Marines in the halls of Montezuma and raised the Mexican flag was the San Patricio Battalion. And what of the memory of the San Patricios? Has Mexico forgotten them? To the contrary, the San Patricios are revered and honored every year in both Mexico and Ireland, and several Mexican presidents have praised them. For example, President Ernesto Zedillo said, "Members of the St. Patrick's Battalion were executed for following their consciences. They were martyred for adhering to the highest ideals. We honor their memory. In the name of the people of Mexico, I salute today the people of Ireland and express my eternal gratitude." In Mexico on September 12th, which is the generally accepted anniversary of the executions, a ceremony is held. Here's a photo of one such ceremony, which is described as follows. Over 1,000 people gather in the plaza of San Angel, where the first group of San Patricios was hanged. A plaque exists there, which you can see in this photo. On the top is an escutcheon depicting the Celtic cross of Ireland, upon which is perched the Mexican eagle. Below the cross is a Spanish inscription that says, "In memory of the heroic battalion of St. Patrick, martyrs who gave their lives for the Mexican cause during the unjust North American invasion of 1847. The names of 71 soldiers, 48 of whom have Irish names, are listed. Beneath the names is the following inscription: with the gratitude of Mexico, 112 years after their sacrifice, 1959. The Mexican Symphony Orchestra plays both the Mexican and Irish national anthems. Students from the San Patricio Battalion School, the Irish ambassador, and a police honor guard place floral tributes on the paving stones in front of the plaque honoring the San Patricios. Someone with an Irish accent then reads the names of the fallen San Patricios as the crowd collectively responds after each name, "He died for the country." Other annual commemorations of the battalion are held elsewhere in Mexico. Numerous schools, churches, and other landmarks in Mexico bear the San Patricios' name, and September 12th is an official holiday in Mexico in honor of the San Patricios. A great depth of positive feeling still exists in Mexico towards the San Patricios. In Ireland, too, an annual commemoration is held on September 12th in Clifton, Galway, where John Riley was born. In 2004, the Mexican government gave a commemorative statue to the Irish government in perpetual thanks for the bravery, honor, and sacrifice of the St. Patrick's Battalion. The statue was erected in Clifton. In the U.S., however, the Army attempted to cover up its treatment of the San Patricios by denying the battalion ever existed. It was not until 1915 that a congressional inquiry forced the Army to admit its cover-up and provide its records on the battalion to the National Archives. In conclusion, I pose this question. What is the significance of the San Patricios? A 1993 article that appeared in Irish America magazine states, despite the verdict of many historians who consider the San Patricio Battalion a bizarre aberration in U.S. military history, these men have earned a prominent place in the hearts of the Mexican people. Perhaps Gonzalo Martinez, a prominent Mexican film director, best summed up those feelings. Standing recently near the embattlements of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, Martinez said, "In every dirty war, there are a few good men who stand up for what is right. The U.S. invasion of Mexico was such a war, and the San Patricios were those kinds of men." Thank you. So we're going to play a short video here for you, I hope.
Give me a T.
T.
Give me an R.
R.
Give me an E.
E.
Give me an A.
A.
Give me an S.
S.
Give me an O.
O.
Give me an N.
N.
What's that spell?
Treason.
What's that spell?
Treason.
One more time.
Treason.
You're all going to get arrested. My name is John Riley. I'll have your ear only a while. I left my dear home in Ireland. It was death, starvation, or exile. When I got to America, it was my duty to go. Enter the army and slog across Texas to join in the war against Mexico. And it was there in the pueblos and hillsides that I occupied homeland. We were heroes.
I just don't have any information on that, I'm sorry. Yes, yeah, Phil.
Yeah, there actually was, there were a number of things, the Taos, after Taos and Gold was, after Mexico was occupied, the Gold was put down.
Yeah, that was after the war was over. Yeah, that was during the American occupation that had started at that point. That's absolutely correct. Yes, ma'am.
I recall from history of high school that there was the slogan by Native Americans, white Americans, against Romanism and rebellion. And my question is, alcohol, I know Grant, a lot of Americans drink, but was that an issue? And what about socialism?
That's an interesting question. I'm not aware of that. I don't know the answer to that question. Yes.
That was used, it helped Cleveland get elected because a Protestant clergyman denounced the Democrats just in New York on the eve of the election as the party of Romanism and rebellion. And the Democrats publicized this. Cleveland carried New York by like 10,000 votes, and with it, the presidential election of 1880.
So that was well after the Mexican War. Thank you, though, for that. Yes, sir.
In the 1830s, 1840s, there was also a women's suffrage movement, and there was also a temperance movement going on at the same time. Anti-slavery, temperance movement, massive reform movements during this time period. One of which played into this discussion was the temperance movement in the 1830s, 1840s.
We have a professor here of history who may be able to answer the questions if I can't. Yeah, Carla.
You said that the San Patricio were acknowledged by Mexico and in Ireland. How about by the Catholic Church?
Not that I know of. There's no, except to the extent that they're recognized in those two countries. I'm sure there's probably clergy involved in the celebrations and the observances on those days, but there's no specific that I'm aware of anyway. Yes, sir.
Well, Grant described the United States as a much more powerful country, but I would assume, that we were relatively equal wealth at the time. Did the Americans really have superior arms and artillery?
Absolutely, absolutely. And they had a whole, I didn't want to get into the whole tactical discussion of the Mexican War, but one of the innovations that the American Army brought to the war was what they call flying artillery. And they could move their light artillery around the battlefield much faster. Well, the Mexicans really had very little light artillery. They had a lot of heavy artillery, but it wasn't as mobile. But no, the Americans, their muskets and their artillery were much longer ranges than the Mexicans had. So the Mexicans were never even able to mount an effective charge because they were killed at long distances from the Americans. So, other questions? Yes.
I've read that Irish men getting off the boat in New York at the time of the Civil War were offered citizenship as they enlisted. Was that convenience or a change of attitude?
I think it was mostly convenience at that point. There were a lot of people who were using, if you were a wealthy man in the Civil War, you could buy a substitute. So if you could get someone off the boat to be your substitute, then you didn't have to go to the war. So there was some of that was going on, undoubtedly. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So an ancillary, my father is from Nice, and I think that I want to know if you know what town your great grandfather came from.
No, it's he was a Civil War veteran also, my great-great-grandfather, and I have his pension records, and in there, all it indicates is that he was born in Westmead, County Ireland, but that's it. Yeah. Anything else? Well, you've been a great audience. Again, thank you so much for coming.